asked him to speak about the topic of creative coexistence in a religious, pluralistic society. So we're really happy to have these two very appropriate representatives of the dialogue between Christianity and Buddhism, and we'll start with Father Will. Thank you.
សូមគោរពជំរាបសួរប្រជាជនគុណជាទីស្រឡាញ់អ្នកអរគ្នាគុណមង្លីហើយបងប្អូនទាំងអស់គ្នាអរគុណដែលបានចូលរួមកម្មវិធីរបស់យើងនៅថ្ងៃនេះសង្ឃឹមថាមានអត្ថប្រយោជន៍មិនមែនតែសម្រាប់យើងតែប៉ុណ្ណោះប៉ុន្តែសម្រាប់ពិភពលោកហើយសម្រាប់ភិតរភាពហើយមិត្តភាពរវាងគ្រិស្តសាសនានិងពុទ្ធសាសនា Today it's a great honor for me to be back here, and it's a bit of a humiliating experience because I just realized how smarter people have become and how much I've forgotten. And it's just such a pleasure to be back in a place that is looking for the truth in the footsteps of Jesus Christ in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas. Thank you so much, Father Thomas Joe's wife, for accepting this encounter. And this is the second of our seminars, and we're doing a third one that you don't know about. And it was Matthew Levering in March in the United States. And I hope that this is starting a movement because in Asia there's such a great need for a renewal of theology and encounter with our brothers from different traditions. So hopefully this can be another footstep in that sense. I'll just introduce briefly who I'm here with because you might not know. I am with the people on this picture, and we were blessed to have a private audience with the Pope this morning. And I'm traveling with San Sochea, who is a venerable monk from Cambodia. He's currently living in Australia, but he's very respected, very listened to in Cambodia. This is his page. So if you think there's only about 50 people or less in this room, there's already 2,000 people who are liking and following our conversation. And this is a page of San Sochea where everything he does is says and commented, and that was us this morning with the Pope. That's San Sochea, who really impressed me with his open-mindedness and his desire to join this program. The second is Meng Ly Kwak, who is a Cambodian American citizen, half American like me, the better half, not the better half, one of the good halves. The two halves are good. And here is his better half, his wife, and Meng Ly is married and has two daughters and is a great friend and an inspiration for me and for all his millions of followers in Southeast Asia, especially in Cambodia. This is a book that Meng Ly wrote called Dongrik Mountains, where Meng Ly shares his experience of going from being a refugee who fled the horrors of communism and escaped as a refugee to Thailand before being welcomed to America, where he became a doctor and decided to go back to his country in 2002 to help build the kingdom again. We're blessed to live in a beautiful country called Cambodia, which is a free kingdom where religion is respected, where freedom is guaranteed. And I've been living there for the past 3 years after leaving the Angelicum. It's been an incredible blessing. And I'm blessed to be here with all of them as we travel to Europe to think of a theme called detachment, conversion, and caring for a common home. So the theme that I would like to talk to you about today is caring for a common home in the footsteps of Jesus Christ and of the Buddha. You know, in Rome there's a place called Quo Vadis, and you go to the church there and you can see the footsteps of Jesus Christ, you know, because Jesus appeared to Peter and we see that it's as if Jesus had come to Rome. In Cambodia also, many places you can see the footsteps of the Buddha, even though historically he never came, but it's kind of like a sign of his presence, you know. It's a sign that Buddhism has stepped on the land of Cambodia. What I'm going to talk to you about now is I'm going to try to answer the fact that there is an issue at hand. Cambodia is a beautiful country, but Cambodia is a country that a friend of mine who was just outside told me has an almost untouched environment. You can go to pristine forest like in Prey Long, where we went with another influential monk called Kusopia, who is a friend of Meng Ly and of San Sochea. But we realize that the environment in Cambodia is threatened, and as Pope Francis says, it is our common home. So how can we care for it? I'm going to try to answer this question because we have to realize that the answer provided by religions has been challenged. It's been challenged as Christians, we know, for many years, and I will show that, I will explain this. But it's being challenged also in a book that came out in 2020. In this conference, very briefly, we'll try to propose a rebuttal to this book, which is a direct attack against the legacy of Buddhism in Southeast Asia. It's called The Buddha's Footprint So it goes from this footprint of Buddha, and it gives an environmental history of Asia, accusing Buddhism of being partly responsible for the destruction of the environment in Asia. Is that true? Can that be sustained? Or could we answer? So out of friendship for my Buddhist friends and also out of concern for my own religious mission, I will try to answer this question to show that the attacks made in this book came out in 2020 from California, Berkeley, another great place in California. Well, I will try to answer the question and try to see how we can together provide an answer and see what religion has to say for the environment. Pope Francis, in his encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, number 201, says, "The majority of people living on our planet profess to be believers. This should spur religions to dialogue among themselves for the sake of protecting nature, defending the poor, and building networks of respect and fraternity. In a spirit of friendship, Buddhists and Catholics in Cambodia have for a long time collaborated for the safeguard of our common planet. However, as I just said, recent scholarship challenges our mission." While Cambodia faced a terrible humanitarian crisis in the refugee crisis of the last century, St. John Paul II and the Venerable Mohago Sananda emerged as prophets for their calls to treat asylum seekers with humanity. In the wake of an environmental crisis, a new prophetic response is needed in the part of religious leaders. However, similar actions may have different and even opposing motivations. So first question, does religion have a footprint? I'll first answer on the Buddhist side and then on the Christian side. On the Buddhist side, I'll try to summarize the argument raised by this author called John Evelskog, who is a scholar who used to be a Buddhist, one of those neo-Buddhists, who thinks Buddhism is cool, doesn't know much about it, and then gets angry about it because he realizes he didn't know anything, and he gets angry about what he thought he knew, realizing he knew almost nothing. And so he gets very angry against Buddhism, and he says, that while Buddhism is still accepted by many as a religion that promotes harmony, not only among men, but also between men and their environment, he raises a critical voice, accusing Buddhism of having a negative footprint on the environment. He says that Buddhism was a prosperity theology centered on the generation of wealth. Making money was a fundamental part of being Buddhist. Producing wealth created positive karma. Using that wealth to support the Dharma increased merit. Even if monks renounced the material world and refrained from killing animals, most Buddhists did not. Thus, as Everskog points out, I quote, "In order to fully appreciate the footprint of the Buddhist tradition and the history of Buddhist Asia, the activities of the lay community need to be brought for the front and center of our analysis." For Buddhism to function properly, he has three arguments. I'll only answer one of them, which is a more philosophical argument. The first argument is economical. He says in order to support the community, if some people don't work, some people have to work more to support what they do through offerings and merit-making celebrations where people have to generate a surplus, and that creates extra activity. And so he says, in some way, that's an economic argument. The second argument is social. He says that there's a hierarchy in Buddhism, in the karma, where, on top of the hierarchy is the Buddha. And the Buddha is a man who is above other men, above the woman, above the created, above everything else. And so he says there's kind of a disrespect, which is actually very easy to answer. And I think San Sochea will answer that question very easily. But the third argument is more difficult. It is the environmental case against the physical impermanence. According to Elfskergog, nature earns little notice in the Buddhist teaching, but when nature does appear in an early Buddhist text, it is typically in terms of impermanence, decay, and as something to be avoided. A practical illustration of this philosophy of impermanence may have, I'll just give this example to explain this, that as Cambodia switched from Hinduism to Buddhism, from Vedic religions to the religion of the Buddha, well, they went from temples made of stone, made to last forever because the gods are eternal, to temples made of wood that will not last more than a few hundred centuries because everything passes. As Father Sherwin said in his talk, how can a religion that promotes the extinction of the self not induce the extinction of the world? So it's a really difficult argument that he makes against impermanence. The other arguments are more easy to answer. But I believe that the easiest answer is, as I will say in the second part, going back from the Buddhist to the Buddha, from, what has been done to what the Buddha did. If we return to the Buddha, we see, well, contrary to what he said in his first argument, again, the economic argument, Buddha had no possession and raised that as a model. He had a stability of life in a world which is impermanent. His life is stable. The life of the Buddha is very stable. The life of monks is very stable. Even though San Sochea is traveling with us, like most monks, they're in their monastery. For all the Vosa season, they do not even go out of their monastery. They're like really present in their monastery. And they live also in the middle of nature, as Buddha did. And most of the moments of the Buddha's life happen in nature. And you see in the deer garden, and all the great moments of Buddha's life is under trees or close to trees, especially the Dampot, the holy tree of Buddhism. So secondly, does Jesus have a footprint? Quo vadis? Interestingly, it's almost the same arguments that are made against Christianity. Those developed in 2020 in this book against Buddha's footprint have been developed since the 1990s, criticizing Christianity of exploiting nature rather than serving nature, drawing, of course, mostly on sociological, economic, and also sociological arguments. The sociological and economic arguments can go back to Max Weber and the spirit of capitalism, and seeing how Christianity is connected with the spirit of exploitation. And it's been criticized for a long time. In a 2008 book, Francisco Benzoni, who writes Ecological Ethics of the Human Soul, Aquinas, Whitehead, and the Metaphysics of Value, Benzoni says, Aquinas and his theology reflect a strictly instrumental understanding of other creatures, which is insufficient to ground environmentalism and care for creation as it is understood today, especially with the notion of biodiversity. It is inapt to offer a framework to ground an adequate ecological ethic. The claim, of course, is in rebuttal of the argument that was made by Jenkins. Willis Jenkins, who wrote in the early 2000s a beautiful kind of ecological vision of the world and a Thomistic trend, and I'll try to build on him. Again, the arguments against this instrumentalization of creation can be rebutted by returning to Jesus as we return to the Buddha. Jesus, as the Buddha, had no possession, had a stable life, and lived in the middle of nature as he, lived his life's hours in the Garden of Olives. Yet, he had power over nature in a way that was different from the Buddha. And that shows also a different relationship between the environment and the human being, as we believe, and that's my answer number 2, a difference between us and Buddhists is that we are creationists. We believe in creation. We believe that the relationship of the human being and the environment is a relationship also of creation. So secondly, I would argue that religion does not have a footprint, but rather footsteps. Firstly, in the Buddhist context. In the Buddhist context, the word in Khmer, in Cambodian, is saveak. It comes from the Sanskrit savaka or the sravaka, in the Malay and Pali, saveak, which means a hearer. So it's important to understand that there is always a need to go back to the reality. Everest Cog judges Buddhism on Buddhist rather than going back to the Buddha. And I think that's a fallacy, because you're judging a history rather than a doctrine, a practice rather than a theory. And so, in my perspective, it's important to go back to understanding that Buddhists are followers, as we said, not of a way, but of a person, of a teaching, of someone called the Buddha. So for me, it's very important to understand this, and to see that a very beautiful example of those footsteps is the birth of Buddha himself. I don't know if you know, but at his birth, Buddha, according to a tradition, according to the Buddhist scriptures, was born and walked on 7 lotus flowers, And for me, this footprint is the true footprint of the Buddha, which means a very light footprint on the world. It's a beautiful image of what this footstep should be. And if we want to walk those 7 footsteps, which are symbolic of Buddhist virtues, we need to walk in a way that is least detrimental to our environment, as Buddha walking on lotus flowers, respecting his environment. This translates into a fundamental notion of Buddhism, which is ahimsa, which Monsignor Indunil talked about when we went to the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Ahimsa, non-violence, reflects means non-violence towards our creation, which means not breaking, not hurting, not deteriorating our environment. How do we answer as Christians? As Christians, we will answer differently. Ahimsa, whereas Christ, of course, was a non-violent person, ahimsa is not a Christian concept. So how do we answer that as Christian? Well, first we have to give rebuttal to the arguments made against Christianity, that a hierarchy of creation is a ladder of shame, that man imposes himself to creation. There's something so beautiful in the optimism of St. Thomas Aquinas on his treatise of creation, where he says that he talks about degrees. And those degrees are degrees in which we are more perfect, not less perfect. We are not Platonists that believe in the decadence of emanations, but we are Catholics who believe in the participation of a greater goodness. So the hierarchy of creation is not a ladder on which we look down on each other, but we look up to each other and up to heaven. So in the question 47, Article 2, where there's a multitude of distinction of things come from God, well, it does. And Aquinas says, in each of the one of the species is more perfect than the others. That's the first point. The second point is that if we look in question 76 of the Prima Pars on the Article 3, again in the Treaty of Creation, is a very difficult question to answer for Aquinas, how different species relate to each other, and how we as humans who don't believe that we're not pantheists, how do we respect creation? It's an interesting argument that he makes, and we see that it's a difficult question already for Aquinas. We cannot impose environmentalism of the 21st century on a middle-aged philosopher and theologian, but we can try to see roots and germs of elements that can help us develop a modern theory to answer the questions of our world. I see that for Aquinas, already at that time, the question is difficult. His respondeo in that question 76, Article 3, is a very long one compared to the one you usually see, with a lot of arguments. Already in the objections, he raises not 3 but 4 objections, which is more than the usual 3. He is one of his strongest Aristotelian arguments against Platonism. Aquinas argues that the soul of man is both different and similar to the animal soul, with a triple distinction, which respects the created soul of every animal. Man has an animal soul, but he is also human. He goes and quotes on the treaty of Aristotle, which we saw yesterday in the Vatican museums, walking and looking for the truth with Plato, and we see that. So he talks about this triple distinction of the soul, and that he roots, according to Aristotle, in the distinction between the 3 sorts of substance, between matter, potentiality, form, actuality, and the compound of matter and form. And there is a nested hierarchy of the functions of the soul, which are growth, locomotion, and intellect. And this gives us 3 corresponding degrees of the soul, which are the nutritive soul, which is shared by everything living, even the plants, a nutritive soul. We need to grow, we need to survive, we need to feed ourselves and grow. The second is a sensitive soul, which is that of animals. Animals not only have a nutritive soul, but also a sensitive soul. And so we share that with all the animals. Animals have, you can hurt them. Animals feel pain. Animals feel separation. And the rational soul, the third level, is proper to humans, which is our honor as human beings to have not only to share this nutritive soul with all the living beings, to share the sensitive soul with all the animals, but to also have the privilege of the rational soul, which is our connection with God as we were created in His image. Thus Aquinas makes this notion that in man the sensitive soul, the intellectual soul, and the nutritive soul are numerically one soul. Thus he beautifully concludes that neither is Socrates a man by one soul and an animal by another, but by one and the same soul he is both animal and man. Thomas Aquinas provides the architecture for later James Schaffer, who will build on these themes to found an effort to ground the green theology of the Catholic faith, valuing the goodness and beauty of creation, respecting creation's praise of God, acknowledging the kinship of all creatures, using creation with gratitude and restraint, and living virtuously within the human community and the earthly community. In the final chapter of his book, Schiffer, who wrote Theological Foundations for Environmental Ethics, reconstructing patristic and medieval concepts in 2009, Schiffer will develop the Thomistic notion of human as a virtuous cooperator, drawn from the teachings of Aquinas. Virtuous cooperator, that's where we link in with ahimsa, with the non-violence concept. Man cannot do evil, and man should do good. This will maybe help create a response to a world in despair in an endangered age? That's the third question. And that's more a question that I will raise, and maybe San Sochea will answer those questions. Are we walking together in these footsteps, or are we walking apart? The first element is maybe we're walking together. The most beautiful image of that is a friendship that exists between the Dalai Lama and Thomas Merton. Monastic life, in a way, is our model of detachment, where we find each other, and in practical things, we connect. The life of San Sochea is not so different in practical terms from that of a Benedictine monk. The prayers are different, but the time schedule is very close. However, our understanding of it is quite different. For a notion like celibacy, which is so important to all of us here as religious people, people see today not having kids as an environmental thing. Are we celibate out of a neo-Malthusian philosophy? Are we celibate because it's more environmental? For Buddhists, celibacy puts an end to the cycle of reincarnation. But for us Christians, we don't have a negative vision of celibacy. It bears fruit in a life and in the next. For us as Christians, celibacy, though we live it in the same way, we try to struggle to stay faithful to it, we live it with very different motivations. So, and that's my conclusion point, there is a necessity for a philosophy of life. If we cannot share the same theological grounding, we need to try to work together for a philosophy of life, aware of the urgent need of conversion in order to safeguard our common home. Can this conversation that we're having on this trip be fooled by the same fire? I believe that we need to talk of conversion as detachment. And that's my question for you, San Sochea. What does Nikam Baramai, Nikam in Buddhism, have to do with the Fuga Mundi of us as Christians? How can we care for creation if we don't care for ourselves? How can we understand that? I believe that we can only preach conversion as an act of love. How can this enlightenment come about? For Christians, it can happen with grace. A change of attitude needs to come from a change of the heart. An ecological conversion will come by a conversion of love. This grace is an inspiration that can also be mediated by men and by women. And as such, inspirational leaders have a responsibility in that sense. Leaders on Facebook, leaders on social networks have a mission to promote this conversion. That our contemporaries may aspire to what religious leaders can inspire. So, what I propose, as we're not arrested as a big show like our dear friend Greta Thunberg, who would only put shame on you as we talk about environmental conversion. Rather than shame, I'd rather put hope. I would rather propose and suggest lovingly, rather than impose shamefully, the need of a greater conversion, not only for the good of our planet, but for the good of all of our humanity. If you have time, San Sochea, please come forward and tell us, just for you, how you would understand this detachment as detachment from the world, whereas we understand it out of love. How do you understand the notion of Nikama Baramai in a few words?
Hello everyone. Straight to the question about the Nekama Barame. It is Pali term. It means the renunciation. The renunciation is referred to how we develop our understanding to eradicate the defilements from our mind, our consciousness. I think every religious leader, the top religious leader, they cannot become the great person or God without renunciation or without Nekama Parami. Like Jesus Christ, He donated all things, even His life, for all beings' happiness. And also Buddha, he have cultivated many lives, the virtue or the Nekama Barame, not only one life. It is a eon that cannot count how many lives that he had done many things to develop his perfection to be the Buddha. There are 10 perfections altogether, but Nekama Barami is one of the 10 perfections. Those who are cultivate the Nekama Barami, they have to give up 3 things. One thing is called in Pali term Kama Vitaka. You know the word Kama Vitaka. It is about sensuous thinking, or eliminate sensual pleasure with all things. And the second one is called Pshiyabada Vitaka. It is thinking of hate. So those who cultivate this perfection is develop the mind to abandon all hatred thing from the mind. So the one who can bring peace to the world, he have to eliminate all hatred in the mind. If he keep the thing of hate in the mind, he cannot bring peace to the world. And the last one is called Vihangsa Vitaka. It is cruelty thinking. So all top leader of the religion, I think, they all cultivate this perfection. They give up everything to bring peace and harmony to the world, because every activities in their life, they never do it with attachment, but they do it with love and compassion. They're living for sharing, not for demanding. They only bring peace to the world. So, like what we have discussed about Mother Nature, we live in this planet. Why we don't live in the moon? Why we cannot live in other planet? Because in the moon there is no tree, no water, no life. So our life always connected to the nature. Like when we breathe in and breathe out, we cannot live only with the wind that go inside and come out, but with oxygen. We as human beings, we cannot produce oxygen. Everything come out from our body is not oxygen at all. What to call when?
Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide, yes. But only the nature can produce it, can make it, and can create it. So that is why we have to take care of our Mother Nature, because we never win. If we destroy the nature, we will be destroyed by the nature, like earthquake, flood, many things. The heat is increasing every day because many people cut the tree. Related to the Buddha step, the Buddha footprint. For me, I am a Buddhist monk. It is like this letter. It is called Pico. Pico. So for Pico, are not allowed to cut the tree at all. Even one tree are not allowed. So even when they are allowed to build a small house in the forest for practice meditation, Buddha allowed only a very small, maybe called cottage or something like for yes, yeah, or whatever, but not too big. Only when we can decorate one bed only, because Buddha don't allow people to destroy the tree a lot. And if someone used to learn the Buddha story, even the day he was born was also in the forest, and the day that it got enlightenment was also in the forest, and the day that he passed away was also in the forest. I remember one sutta that his disciple asked him, "My Lord, why don't you choose any city for your last time before you pass away? Why don't you choose any city or where surrounded by people?" Buddha said, city or forest are the same, because thousand years ago, this place used to be a very big city. But when the time passed by, everything is changed. So to him, city or forest, nothing different. But he preferred forest rather than the city. So, what to say more? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank Rector Father Thomas Joseph and the university for inviting me to speak to you. It is my pleasure to talk about creative coexistence in a religious pluralistic society, as suggested by Father Thomas. I think the topic is more relevant and even more important than ever before in today's world of prolific fake news, pervasive social media, and persistent human conflicts, despite many lessons learned from history. Now let me start by doing what all good professors do. Anyone would like to guess what I've done? Any volunteer?
Define.
Sorry.
Definition. Definitions?
Definition! That's correct. You read my mind, brother. I did some internet research just to make sure that I get the definition correct. So it's not just my definition, but really, trying to assimilate what I gathered from the internet, and this is what I define religious pluralism. I think it refers to the idea that multiple religions can coexist within a society, and that individuals should be free to practice their own religion without interference or discrimination. Easier said than done. Right? Father Wills talk about walking together or walking apart. Now, what about creative coexistence? Creative coexistence in a religious pluralistic society involves finding ways for people of different religions to live and work together harmoniously, respecting and valuing each other's beliefs and practices. So what I'm going to share with you is more down to earth, and certainly not in the realm of philosophy, which all of you have been exposed up to now. Now the topic also presupposes that creative coexistence is constructive and not destructive, and requires an open and inclusive mindset and a willingness to seek out and engage with people of different faiths and beliefs. So on that note, I would now like to share with you my personal thoughts and opinions on the subject based on the Singapore model. Now what I will share with you is my personal prognosis. Although I have held various appointments as my contribution to public service on a voluntary basis for over 25 years, I do not represent the Singapore government. So I repeat, I do not represent the Singapore government. Having been born and brought up in Singapore, I've experienced and lived through several monumental epochs of Singapore history, from the 50s to today, over 7 decades, and my white hair is proof of that. For example, the first calamitous racial riots in 1964.
The other arrow.
The other, no, correct. This is one. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I don't have stage fright, but I do. Now, the agenda for my sharing will cover the following: a brief history and background of Singapore, the holistic approach taken by Singapore through policies and laws, as well as an economic blueprint, and finally, the role of leadership, given that I'm a professor of leadership and entrepreneurship at our National University of Singapore. In July 1964, Singapore had our first major racial riots between the Chinese and Malays. Less than 1 year after Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia, which included Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak. So for many of the Asians here, you can identify with the countries, especially our Malaysian friend here and our Cambodian friend. Right. No one in Singapore expected this to happen. No one. Until this tumultuous upheaval that crippled the entire nation, the different races were living together in peaceful coexistence since the founding of Singapore. The riots were triggered by clashes between Malay and Chinese youth during a procession organized by the Malays to celebrate Prophet Muhammad's birthday, unfortunately set in an environment where racial tensions were already running high, incited by political extremists and the media. Although it happened during a religious event, religion wasn't the primary cause. I repeat, religion wasn't the primary cause. It was politically instigated along racial lines. Malaysia had a Bumiputra policy to accord special rights to Malays. That policy still exists today. Lee Kuan Yew, then our first Prime Minister, was advocating a Malaysian Malaysia, where every citizen will be treated equally, which upset the central government in Malaysia and Malay interest groups. Malay political extremists saw Lee Kuan Yew as a threat, and through further incitement of anti-Chinese sentiments, exploited the celebration to trigger a racial riot. Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia in 1965 and is no longer part of the Federation, existing now as a republic. Now, what is clear is that racial and religious harmony is extremely fragile, and politicians will exploit it for political gains, even though they are aware that they are playing dangerously with fire. Sorry, I've got to get used to the mouse here. Sister, is there a better way for me to...
If you click it, Professor, you
No,
should...
I haven't clicked it. I want to bring the arrow. Oh, sorry. Now, developing and building creative coexistence in a religious pluralistic society is not easy. Hard truths and realities are obstacles that need to be recognized and overcome. Fault lines always exist in a multiracial and multi-religious society. It is extremely more challenging to achieve multi-religious unity in a heterogeneous, i.e. multi-racial society compared to one that is homogeneous. I was sharing with the professor outside, even in India, where you've got a homogeneous society, you have frequent clashes between the Muslims and the Hindus. And it is almost impossible to separate race from religion, and vice versa. And the challenge is further complicated by class discrimination. We cannot expect people to treat others of diverse religious beliefs equally, subconsciously or otherwise. And it's largely a question of degree due to our cognitive systems of biases and prejudices. And in a world full of deception, some of these are self-inflicted because of bias and prejudices, and some because of trust in others who have different motives. Finally, a rigid dichotomy between social good and political goals and capital will always exist. And in that sense, I would advocate that all politicians must rise above self-interest and move towards what I call self-exceeding. In other words, putting self-interest aside, but looking at what you can do for the social good. The July 1964 racial riots played a significant role in shaping some of Singapore's fundamental principles, such as multiculturalism and multiracialism, once Singapore had gained independence from Malaysia in 1965. For example, our Internal Security Act grants the executive powers against actions that may threaten the internal security of Singapore, including those that promote feelings of ill will and hostility between different races or other classes of the population, like religious groups, likely to cause violence. And Lee Kuan Yew declared that we are going to have a multiracial nation in Singapore. We will set the example. This is not a Malay nation. This is not a Chinese nation. This is not an Indian nation. Everybody will have his place. Equal language, culture, and religion. So, as a multiracial society, Singapore has inherited a legacy of different religious beliefs, practices, and traditions. To achieve creative coexistence in a religious pluralistic society, a country needs to find ways to accommodate diversity, such as through laws and policies that protect the rights of individuals to practice their religions and express their beliefs. This is what Singapore has done, introducing laws and policies to promote and preserve racial and religious harmony. The Singapore Constitution emphasized the need to adopt non-discriminatory policies based on race and or religion. Furthermore, the state also guaranteed the grant of minority rights and to ensure that the minorities in Singapore are not mistreated. The Maintenance of the Religious Harmony Act was drafted and implemented in 1990. Furthermore, there is the Presidential Council for the Minority Rights, which was established in 1970 to ensure that the bills